All right, so you're here because you want to get right to the good stuff, right? You want the knowledge, but you want it fast.
That's us in a nutshell.
And today we're going to be looking at something pretty pivotal, but often kind of forgotten when we think about the American Revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's the Battle of Ridgefield over in Connecticut, April 1777.
A fascinating battle. And you've brought some really intriguing snippets and accounts that detail a British incursion, its fiery raid, and the really surprising chain of events that followed.
Yeah, and what we really want to do today is go a little deeper, right? We want to figure out what really sparked this whole conflict. Like, what were the motivations on both sides, and what were some of the less obvious consequences of this battle?
I think that's a fantastic goal.
So maybe a good place to start is just thinking about Connecticut during those first few years of the Revolution. You know, we always think about the big clashes in places like Massachusetts or around New York,
Right?
but Connecticut always seems to be kind of on the periphery, wouldn't you say?
That's a really great point. And for the first couple of years, Connecticut really was primarily a supporter providing supplies and manpower to the Continental Army. It wasn't a main stage for the conflict.
Right.
Which is precisely why this British raid in 1777 is so significant.
Yeah.
It brought the war to Connecticut's doorstep in a way it hadn't experienced before.
And this wasn't just, some random act of aggression.
No.
The British had a much broader strategy in mind for 1777, right? Like, what were their big goals that year?
So the main focus for the British in 1777 under General Howe was the capture of Philadelphia, the American capital at that time.
Of course.
But Howe also allowed for some flexibility, so there was room for operations in other strategic areas like the Hudson River Valley or Connecticut, and ultimately that decision was left to Major General William Tryon.
And of course, Tryon had a history in this area, right? He was a former royal governor of New York.
Exactly.
That must have played a role in his thinking.
Absolutely. His prior experience and connections in the region definitely influenced his choices.
And why Danbury? Why focus on that specific town?
Danbury was strategically vital. It served as a major supply depot for the Continental Army established in 1776.
Okay.
It was a crucial hub, funneling resources to American forces operating in the Hudson Valley. You can think of it as a logistical backbone for that entire northern theater.
So, yeah, disrupting or destroying that depot would have a huge impact on the American war effort.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just a guess, right? Tryon had pretty solid intel about what was in Danbury.
He did indeed. His information came from a spy working for Guy Johnson, a British Indian agent.
Wow.
And this really highlights the vital role of intelligence gathering during the war and how loyalist networks were being used by the British to identify vulnerable targets.
Yeah.
Combined with Tryon's earlier success with the raid on Peekskill, New York, Danbury likely appeared to be a relatively accessible and high-value target.
Okay, so the target is locked in. What kind of force are we talking about here? Did the British assemble for this? I mean, this wasn't just like a small scouting party, right?
Oh, not at all. Tryon committed a significant force to this operation, approximately 1,500 regular British soldiers drawn from various regiments, including the 4th, 15th, 20th, 27th, 44th, and 64th.
Wow.
He also had about 300 loyalists from the Prince of Wales American Regiment and a small contingent of the 17th Light Dragoons.
Okay.
Leading this force were Generals Erskine and Agnew, to Tryon himself taking overall command with a temporary promotion to Major General of the Provincials.
That's a lot of troops for what seems like, on the surface, at least a localized raid. So how did this sizable force even get from New York to Connecticut?
They set sail from New York on April 22nd with a fleet of 12 transport ships, a hospital ship, and a number of smaller vessels, all under the command of Captain Henry Duncan.
Okay.
Their destination was Compo, which is present-day Westport, where they landed on April 25th.
All right.
This provided them with a relatively direct inland route towards Danbury.
So the British have landed. Their objective is Danbury. What kind of resistance are we talking about here? What was the American presence in Danbury at this time?
The American forces stationed in Danbury were quite small, only around 50 Continental Army soldiers and roughly 100 local militias.
Okay.
All under the command of Colonel Joseph Platt Cook.
Right.
And given the sheer size of the British force, the initial American resistance was quickly overwhelmed.
And I imagine news of this landing and the subsequent raid on Danbury traveled fast.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Messengers were sent out immediately upon the British landing near Norwalk.
Right.
The news reached key American commanders like Major General David Wooster and Brigadier General Benedict Arnold, who were both in New Haven at the time.
Okay.
And Brigadier General Gold S. Silliman was already in the vicinity, moving towards Reading, which became a focal point for organizing the American response.
So Wooster and Arnold are in New Haven. Silliman is moving towards Reading. What are their immediate steps to counter this British advance?
Wooster acted quickly, dispatching the New Haven militia towards Fairfield. He and Arnold then set off for Reading themselves to join Silliman and coordinate their efforts to gather a force capable of challenging the British. The priority was to assemble enough men to at least harass the British, and if possible, prevent them from returning to their ships without a fight.
Right.
They were able to pull together some troops, but the circumstances were far from ideal.
I can imagine.
Yeah, the assembled American force was about 500 regular militia and maybe 200 volunteers.
Okay.
And they were hampered by heavy, persistent rain as they moved towards Danbury.
Oh, wow.
By the time they reached Bethel, just 2 miles short of Danbury, it was late in the evening, around 11 p.m.
Okay.
Facing those conditions and the very real concern that their gunpowder would be too wet to fire, effectively they decided to halt for the night.
That makes sense tactically. So
Yeah.
while the Americans are trying to get organized, the British are already in Danbury. What happens when they reach their target?
Upon reaching Danbury, the British quickly dispersed the small group of American defenders, and then they systematically destroyed the Continental Army's supplies.
Oh, well.
They eliminated a significant amount of crucial resources essential for the American war effort, especially for operations in the Hudson Valley, which was the primary objective of their mission.
So a pretty clear tactical victory for the British on paper. I mean, they destroyed vital resources. The immediate impact of that is very obvious.
Right.
But what we're seeing in our sources here is hinting at a less obvious and maybe even more significant consequence brewing.
Absolutely.
How could this seemingly successful raid actually help the American cause in the long run?
That's the big question, isn't it?
But before we get there, the Americans weren't just going to let the British stroll back to their ships, were they?
No, they were not.
This is where General Wooster comes back into the story.
That's right. On April 27th, as the British began their withdrawal south towards their ships, General Wooster and his men launched a series of attacks on Tryon's rear guard.
Okay.
There were 2 engagements, and tragically, it was during the second of these encounters that General Wooster was mortally wounded.
Oh, no.
He died from his injuries 5 days later.
A huge loss for the Americans.
A major loss, and it highlights the personal cost of this seemingly small event.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have the engagement that lends its name to this whole deep dive, the Battle of Ridgefield. What happened there?
So as the British continued their march south, they ran into a much larger American force waiting for them at Ridgefield.
Okay.
This force was made up of several hundred militias, and it was under the command of Benedict Arnold. This marked the most significant direct confrontation between the two sides during this whole series of events.
And this wasn't a static stand and fight kind of battle, right? My understanding is that it was more of a running engagement through the town.
You're exactly right. The Americans initially engaged the British on Ridgefield's main street, but despite putting up a good fight, they were outnumbered and forced to retreat.
Okay.
What followed was a running battle as the British pushed the American militia back through the town.
Wow.
But even as they retreated, the Americans inflicted casualties on the British, showing their continued defiance.
So the British achieved their initial military objective. They destroyed the supplies in Danbury. But what was the bigger picture here? What was the real impact of this raid beyond that immediate tactical success?
Well, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
While the British accomplished their goal, their actions had a profound strategic impact, particularly on the sentiment of the people in Connecticut.
Okay.
The raid itself, the fighting, the destruction, it all served to really galvanize Patriot support in the region.
Oh, wow.
It fueled resentment against the British and strengthened the resolve of the people in Connecticut to support the cause of independence.
So it seems like, in a way, the British raid might have backfired by hardening local opposition in Connecticut?
Precisely. While they destroyed supplies, they also inflamed the passions of the locals, making any future British efforts to gain support or exert control in Connecticut that much more challenging.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, can a tactical victory ever truly be a strategic blunder if it alienates the local population?
That's a good question. And did this raid have any lasting effect on British military strategy in this part of the colonies?
It seems to have had some influence. While the British continued to conduct raids on coastal communities in Connecticut throughout the war, they didn't attempt any further deep incursions into the interior on the scale of a Danbury raid.
Okay.
This suggests that the resistance they encountered, even though it didn't prevent the initial destruction of the depot, made them more cautious about undertaking similar operations in the future.
They had to reassess the risk.
Exactly.
And what about the human cost of this operation? What were the casualties like for both sides?
The historical records indicate that the Americans suffered around 20 killed and 80 wounded during these engagements.
Okay.
British casualties were higher at 154 killed and wounded and about 40 taken prisoner.
So a clear tactical win for the British. They destroyed the Danbury supply depot, but it came at a pretty high cost, both in terms of casualties and perhaps more importantly in terms of solidifying Patriot sentiment within Connecticut. A seemingly isolated military action with some far-reaching consequences.
It's fascinating how this raid that was intended to weaken the American ability to fight in the Hudson Valley might have actually contributed to a stronger, more unified American resolve in a region that had previously been relatively peaceful.
Wow.
It really shows us the complex and often unpredictable relationship between military actions and civilian populations.
Absolutely. So we've gone pretty deep on the Battle of Ridgefield, the initial British plan, the events on the ground, the American response, and the immediate aftermath.
We covered a lot of ground.
You should have a much clearer picture of this pivotal moment in the Revolutionary War.
And if we zoom out a bit and think about the bigger picture of a war, this series of events really emphasizes the multifaceted nature of conflict.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about winning battles on the field. It was also deeply intertwined with the hearts and minds of the people. The Battle of Ridgefield is a great example of how a seemingly small military success could have unintended strategic repercussions by impacting popular support and ultimately shaping the course of the war.
Absolutely. So we saw a British tactical success, but a strategic setback.
That's right.
It really makes you think, what other seemingly minor events in history might have had similar disproportionate impact?
It's a fascinating thought.
What does that tell us about the complexities of warfare and the power of popular sentiment in shaping how things turn out in the past? It's something to think about, that's for sure.
I agree.
Thanks for exploring this fascinating piece of history with us.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.